everyone, and welcome to Trial Site News Podcast. I'm Dr. Erin, your host, and today we have two guests. We have Dr. Pamela Tenaerts and we have Ken Getz. Now, I know, Pamela, you're at Medable, and Ken, you're at the Executive Director and Professor at Tufts Center of Drug Development. So before we jump into the study that you guys did together, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that your center does and your company does?
Happy to do that. Pam, would you like to go first?
Since you're talking, why don't you go first? Yeah.
So as you pointed out, Erin, I'm the executive director at a think tank that's part of the Tufts University School of Medicine. And we do studies on drug development, the whole landscape, trends, practices, solutions that are being applied to drug development activity and the impact on performance and efficiency. And we're about 50 years old, and all of our studies are evidence-based. We gather a lot of hard data to understand impact and what this might mean in terms of the speed to bring a drug to the market, and also what the impact might be on the regulatory process, on the clinical trial experience for those who are executing the trial or participating in the study.
Okay, thank you. Pamela, would you like to go?
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Tenaerts. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Medable. And Medable is a decentralized clinical trial organization. And what we do is we really aim to bring clinical trials to anyone everywhere with the goal to accelerate drug development and bring therapies to patients faster. In the science department, our role is really around providing the evidence so that we can all go to responsible adoption, the evidence for how DCTs work, how these elements come together and how they work, do they work, and sort of put numbers around the things that we've all pinned our hopes on in DCTs, that it's a better experience for patients and sites, that it's a faster cycle time, so faster enrollment period, because we can have a more bigger reach than the normal site would have had, because people would have to drive in, and there's just a limitation at that. More than 70% of patients live more than 2 hours away from a clinical research site. And at some point that becomes a barrier for people. So our goal is to take those barriers away and provide high quality data with clinical trials that people can then use for their drug development programs.
Okay, great. Now, I read the paper, Decentralized and Hybrid Trials Deliver Greater ROI, return on investment, than traditional trials. And Pamela, you touched a little bit on the differences between a decentralized trial and a non-decentralized trial. Now this study, and jump in if I say anything incorrect, but this study quantified the net financial return on an investment, on a decentralized trial investment. And you used something called the expected net present value, or ENPV.
Correct.
Okay, so can we just start there? Can we talk a little bit about what that means?
Can I actually take one step back and
Sure.
give you a definition that we use for decentralized clinical trials? Because we find out there's sometimes confusion around that.
Sure.
And then I'll let Ken do the ENPV.
Okay.
So we use the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative's definition. And the definition we use is that it's a DCT is a clinical trial in which some or all of the study assessments or visits are conducted at locations other than the investigator site via different elements. So it could be a combination of televisits, local or mobile healthcare providers, so your own doctor in your town versus, the tertiary hospital center, 3 hours away. It could include local labs. And by the way, some of these things we used to do that way, and we've just now bundled them into the DCT elements, or imaging centers. And then we also could do home delivery of investigational products. So they can be completely remote, where nobody ever sees anybody ever. Most of the ones we have studied here are hybrid versions, where some things are done remotely away from the traditional clinical trial site in a way that where the data collection happens, and some parts of the trial are done at the investigator side. So with that background, I'll turn it to Ken and go on mute for my dogs who are barking, and let him talk about EMPV.
Great. And it's a great place to begin, Erin. It's essentially a quantitative model that we use to determine the return on an investment that's being made. And in this case, we're looking at a longer horizon. There's a period of time where investments being made, and then there'll be a period of time where there'll be a return or there'll be revenue generated for that investment in a development program. And we discount that back to today's dollars. And that's why it's a net present value. So it's a very, very commonly used approach. What's nice about it is it kind of marries the science with what bean counters and what sort of corporate wants to look at, right? It's not enough just to say, for example, that a particular approach is resulting in a faster timeline, but knowing that there might be additional investment in a particular solution or a new practice, what's the relationship between the benefits or the improvement that an approach might bring? And when we discount that back, what's the difference between what it may have generated in terms of net present value before that investment was made compared to after the investment has been made? And so that's really what we've done in this study. We've used a modeling approach, and we populate the model with a lot of the data that we collect at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, and with some data that Medable provided, and we'll be able to talk more about the different data elements. But all of the data points are based on benchmarks, most that have been published in peer review journals.
Okay, and for Medable, did you guys provide a lot of the data for the decentralized trials?
We provided a lot of data on contract value, because what we had is we needed to have studies that were finished. And this study, the research study with Tufts, happened at a time where we had been starting a lot of studies. We didn't have that many studies that were finished, but we did provide some case studies and most of the contract value. And then the protocol performance data came from a Tufts proprietary data set that included DCT trials and non-DCT trials. So.
Okay, great. So can we talk about some of these performance indicators, which I think might have been chart 1 in the paper? Because I think you do hear about these a lot when you compare decentralized trials and non-decentralized trials. And maybe we can just break it down for people what they are, if they really don't know much about research or a clinical trial. So protocol amendments being one, screen failure rate, and phase duration. Can you guys break those down, maybe talk about
Sure.
each? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even before we dive into their definitions, I just want to also mention that this model was populated with actual data, but we're just building our data set. So we hope to have data on other parameters and other areas where performance might have been impacted in the future. This was a very first attempt. So each of those relates to a different aspect of performance. Phase duration really relates to the time frame from the beginning of a clinical trial, if it's an earlier stage phase 2 program or a later stage phase 3. We look at really when the trial begins, once the protocol has been approved, and now we're looking to begin screening and enrolling study volunteers, all the way through to the end of the trial when the database is locked and now the data can be analyzed. So that's essentially the phase duration component here. When we look at screen failure rates, that really relates to the effort to attract study volunteers and then to assess whether they're eligible to participate in the trial, to be randomized and enrolled. And so when you have a high screen failure rate, it means often that you're attracting a large number of people, but the eligibility criteria, the inclusion and exclusion criteria may prevent them from qualifying. They may not be in the right age group. They may have a certain aspect of the disease, and it's at a stage that would disqualify them for the trial. They may have another illness that they're battling with at the same time, and that might make them ineligible to participate. Every trial has different eligibility criteria. Protocol amendments are sort of a later stage within the clinical trial activity, these are unbudgeted and unplanned changes that are made to the protocol in order to get it back on track, in order to address perhaps an issue in the trial where it's not meeting its timelines, or there may be the introduction of some aspect that changes the design of the study, like a new standard of care has been introduced or has been approved, and now the trial will make a comparison between the study drug and that new standard of care. So there's lots of reasons why sometimes trials are adjusted or amended while they're underway. The number one reason why trials are amended, though, is because they can't find enough study volunteers who are eligible. So amendments, recruitment really go hand in hand, and that's one of the keys to why DCTs are having an impact on reducing protocol amendments.
Okay.
I think that's exactly right, because I used to be at a site and there would be times where we would call for exclusions to an exemption to the inclusion exclusion criteria. And if that happens often enough and the exemptions become something that is still okay to include, that's when that amendment will happen. So if we now can find more patients with the original inclusion exclusion criteria, because there's more flexibility of people that can participate, it's easier to participate, then you don't have to make that amendment down the road. You don't have to ask for those exemptions either, probably. Yeah.
So I'm going to get into a specific return on investment question, but can you guys talk about how those three factors compared between decentralized trials and non-decentralized trials?
Yes, those were the three factors of many that we looked at that were impacted significantly. They were improved significantly when a DCT solution was deployed to support the trial. And I want to come back to a point that Pam made because it's so important. In this initial study, it was all pre-pandemic, and it was a convenient sample. At the Tufts Center, we'd been gathering data on protocol design, and at the last minute, we threw in a question for protocol authors to just indicate whether, in fact, they used one or a number of DCT solutions. So in some cases, it may be a single approach. In others, it may be the combination of telemedicine, a wearable device, home a visit, or a home delivery of clinical trial supplies. So in this study, when we compared those projects or trials that did not have any DCT support to those that did, we observed a significant improvement in screen failure rates, a significant reduction in the mean number of protocol amendments, and I believe it was around a 10% improvement in the speed of the phase duration or the clinical trial duration.
And Ken, wasn't it so that the cycle time improvement was the biggest driver of the ENPP?
Yes.
That the other ones were big too, but that was the most significant one. And at 10%, that's really a conservative baseline. And one of the things we'll need to do down the road is, as an enterprise, collect more data to tease out which elements have more impact on what portion of the return on investment.
Right, that the average duration for a phase 2 or phase 3 trial, and in this study, we're using benchmark numbers. It suggests around like a 3-month time savings. As Pam mentioned, that 3 months really translates into a number of advantages that result in essentially realizing revenue that a drug, once it's approved and enters the market, is able to generate. So speed or time is always one of the biggest drivers of value when we're looking at an ENPV model.
Right. And that was actually a question down the line about cycle time. And just to drive home that point, you're just talking about the duration of the trial. Right. Cycle time. Okay.
In some companies, it's a very, very straightforward benefit. Because typically the investment in a lot of solutions is really a minimal direct cost when you look at the time benefit that it creates. And that's really clearly indicated even in this very first model, despite the investment, and we're assuming multiple deployments in phase 2 and phase 3, the time-based benefit alone really more than covers the investment that's required to deploy the solution.
And
The
that
other
is,
thing, yeah.
Go ahead.
Just one last thing. I'm sorry, Erin. We get so excited about
No,
this.
this is good. Makes my job easy.
And it's something that Pam brought up that we're not measuring. At the same time that you can quantify financial return and you can look at performance, there are a whole bunch of intangible benefits that are not even included in the model. Like, we know some patients prefer to be able to participate remotely. They want that convenience. Sites like to be able to have to offer options to their study volunteers. So there's a lot of benefits that we can't even model here that are important considerations for those designing studies and those executing them.
And at Medable, maybe one of the things I'd like to add is if we think about phase duration, like how long it takes for the whole trial from protocol design to, database lock, in there, for example, is IRB submissions. And what we've learned is that IRB submissions now actually take longer than they used to with a DCT trial than with a regular trial, because most IRBs are very comfortable identifying regular trial, ethics situations, scientific situations. With DCTs, we're throwing all these new things into there, like how should they think about privacy? How should they think about collecting data, unblinding? And what we find is that IRBs actually have to go back and forth a couple of times. So currently, a lot of DCTs have a 3-month, 4-month turnaround time at an IRB because they don't have all the information up front. So we're working with Harvard and MRCT Barbara Beer to find better practices to improve that, so that could be another month or 2 that we could shave off if we can do that better. So we're trying to work all these different angles to identify things that are different slightly that we need to figure out, like IRB submissions and other issues as well. So one of the goals is to do some more ongoing data collection and figure this out. This is the first time, I believe, that there's been some harder numbers around DCTs. We've had a lot of vanity metrics, like, we have investment and we have so many more people at our company, and that's all great. That shows that there's a promise there. I'm not going to deny that, but we need to actually get to the actual impact of DCTs, in my opinion, to drive this forward responsibly.
And that's a great point. And I was going to ask you like how we could optimize, decentralized trials, but I just wanted to go back. For people who, part of TrialSite is to make the clinical trial process a little more transparent to regular people. Can you just explain what an IRB is?
Oh,
briefly.
Yeah. So institutional review board is a group of people that every time a clinical trial starts at a particular site, there's a group of people that looks at that protocol to make sure that it's appropriate, that no harm is done to the participants, that it's a safe environment, the scientific question is valuable, and it's sort of an ethics protection for participants. There's a review of the consent form to make sure that people actually know part of participating in a clinical trial, you're a volunteer. So you're signing up for something voluntarily. Our responsibility is to tell you exactly what you're signing up for. And the IRB is a group of people that looks at that. So that's a process that's in place to ensure that we're not sort of like we wouldn't do that, but it's happened in the past. This is why, yes.
Like
so that's that group, yeah. So, and then now IRBs are sometimes a little more overarching, that one IRB can do a determination for a group of clinical trials, but basically it's a group of people making sure that the science is on the up and up, that patients are respected, that they can make a good decision, and all those things.
Perfect. So did your data mostly come from phase 2 trials versus phase 3? And if you guys just want to quickly talk about the difference in phase 2 versus phase 3?
Yeah, the data came from a combination of the two. It was somewhat of an even split. We looked at phase 2 trials as well as phase 3. Phase 2 trials are the first time typically that an investigational drug is going to be tested with people who actually are managing or living with a given disease. So typically before that, with the exception of oncology and a few other disease conditions, most trials are tested among a healthy population in phase 1 before moving into a small but later stage phase 2 program. If a drug shows promise, it has a reasonable safety profile, it will advance to phase 3, and that is a much, much larger study, typically conducted globally. It will involve several hundred, if not even up to 1,000 patients. So the phase 3 programs are the largest, and their purpose is really to demonstrate the efficacy of the drug, to continue to demonstrate safety, and they even gather other important information that will inform the commercialization of the drug once it's approved.
Yeah, and I think that's also why the return on investment is slightly different in phase 2 than in phase 3, because phase 2 trials are a little bit smaller. They're a safety trial. And so we had a mean contract value of about $470,000, and you need about four of those phase 2 trials to have a whole phase 2 program. So that, and then in phase 3, the contract value is higher because there's a lot more patients typically involved, more like $1 million of DCT investment. And the number of trials you need per phase 3 program is about 3. So that's why the return on investment is 5 times in phase 2 and 13 times in phase 3. It's just the difference in numbers and how big a trial is and how many you need of a trial in a phase.
Right. But here, Erin, and maybe your viewers will find this fascinating. Here's where the modeling gets to be quite complicated, because remember, time plays a big part in when you discount back the revenue that will be generated by a drug. And if you discount it back to an earlier time, then you actually get more value. And then we also know that the risk of a drug getting approval, getting the go-ahead, the green light to move into phase 3, the risk is much greater in phase 2 than phase 3. So a much smaller number of drugs will advance into phase 3. So that risk is also associated with changes in how we model the return, and that all of that has to be built in when we try to come up with a hard number for that rate of return.
Yeah, I think one of the ways I always look at it is earlier money is better money, right? Especially now with inflation. If inflation is 10%, like your $10 now is only worth 9 whenever the next time frame is. So earlier is better. So that's why and phase 3 takes longer. So that's why there's also that difference makes a bigger difference. Yeah.
Yeah. And why we have to model this, because there's all these moving parts that have to be incorporated into the model.
So it sounds.
And let me just say that it was Joe Damasi was the principal investigator on this study, and it's really Ken and Joe that have done all that.
The hard work. I was going to say, I'm sure it's easy to model all this. No, kidding. But I appreciate you guys taking the time to demystify this process for people, because I think people hear phase 2, phase 3, and they just don't know really what you're talking about if you're not working in clinical trials. So let's go back to return on investment. What did your study show? What are some numbers, specifics that you can provide when it comes to a decentralized trial versus a non-decentralized?
And what I will do, Ken, I'm going to let you talk to that. I'm going to try and pull up the graphic because I think that really shows it well, but I'm hoping it's going to work. So let me try to do that.
So if we distill it down to a couple of key takeaways, Erin, what we found is that if you deployed a DCT solution during the phase 2 period for a given drug moving through development, it essentially would bring you roughly a 5 times return on that investment. And as Pam was mentioning earlier, once it enters phase 3, these are so much larger. They're very longer duration studies. If you make the investments in DCT deployment in phase 3, you're looking at a 13 times or a 13x multiple on the investment that you made to deploy DCT. Those are really great return multiples. There are lots of other places where clinical teams will make an investment where the return is not nearly as substantial. And we are only able to model some elements of the benefit right now. We think that with more granular data, we'll obviously have even deeper understanding of the time investment and the dollar investment, but also on the benefit and the impact that we can actually model as well.
So we started to chat a little bit about ways to optimize decentralized trials and make them grow bigger, I guess, include more people. We mentioned IRB, improving that process. What other things, based on your study, your research experience, do you think needs to be optimized, or where there needs to be more work?
So I think what we all want is responsible adoption. And so if we say that the hopes is that, and I believe this, that it's better patients, it's a better experience for patients, it's a better experience for sites. The diversity is actually better because we can reach more people. And we have to be careful that we don't only create decentralized clinical trials that are for the digitally enabled. Like, we have to be able to include my mom, who can't really use a cell phone despite all the versions that we bought for her, or somebody who doesn't have access to Wi-Fi, or only one computer in the house, and a plan that doesn't support the downloads of all these things. That we have to think of the diversity and do best practices and share those about how we can optimize the DCT elements itself, but also have a responsibility to show the metrics associated with all the things that we do. I mean, I truly believe this is a better way, but things have happened before where we thought something was better and it was kind of better, but not exactly. Now we need to tweak it. We need to be responsible and tweak it. So I think the work that needs to happen is around hard numbers of what we're actually doing, and then really making sure that we don't only create decentralized trial possibilities for people that know how to use technology. We have to bring this to everyone in a way that maybe before you didn't have transportation to come, well, now you may not have Wi-Fi. So we need to think of, and there's solutions. We can work on all those. We can provision devices. We can, deliver hotspots. We can work with community retail pharmacies so that maybe patients can go there to do something and they have access to different things there. So I think it's a matter of, as it's a nascent technology, it's nascent. So we need to just make sure that we don't leave new people behind that we weren't leaving behind before.
And Pam really covered so much. I'll just add briefly that almost every aspect can be optimized further. Really on the planning, the level of planning, there's a lot we don't know about which specific solutions or combination of solutions might be better for a particular group of patients or another, or even by disease condition. We don't really have insight there, and what some of the limitations might be. And then on the execution side in particular, there's so much more we're learning about what the sites have to deal with as they're starting to get trained or become familiar with different approaches. We have to really start to look at their own infrastructure and how that will integrate or be coordinated with the solutions that are used. So there's so much that we can understand. And then at the end of the trial, once the data is locked, there are a host of issues that we can optimize in terms of coordinating data coming from multiple sources and integrating that data. So a lot we can.
Ken said it better than I did. It's really like any different aspect of a DCT, we should look at individually and create metrics around it, best practices around it, and workflows. Because I think the times where you could throw technology over the fence and go, use it, it's easy. I mean, I think we all kind of know that that's not how it really works anymore. And it requires people to do things in slightly new ways. Coordinators may have to become a little bit more proficient in, going online, being a little bit of a help. All those things are changing. All our jobs are changing a little bit with all this. And I think that's what we need to work through too.
Hey guys, I hate to be the Debbie Downer, but unfortunately I have to jump into another meeting. Is that all right, Erin, if I hop on?
Yeah. I just, my last question was, what sort of research you have planned, your center has planned, if you just want to offer like a 10-second soundbite, and then Pamela could talk about what Medable's up to.
Yeah.
Great, absolutely. And in fact, your question about optimization is at the heart of what we're trying to do. Next steps for us, and we alluded to this, is really to collect more data on our actual experience working with individual virtual and remote solutions so that we can do even more accurate modeling and we can optimize a lot of these individual components that Pam was mentioning.
All right. Thank you so much, Ken, for being here.
Great.
And
I'm sorry
yeah,
I have to jump
that's
off,
okay.
guys.
That's okay.
So long. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And Pamela, do you want to talk a little bit about what Medable's up to?
Yes, so we have a science department, and we're really trying to sort of put some meat around what I was just talking about, is getting at metrics, getting at best practices, and getting at evidence, and then using that to inform how we do things. So we have work coming up around e-consent, we have work coming up around IRBs and other things. So there will be more coming as we go. We're very excited, yeah. And I'm really glad that we took this route of trying to be evidence-based, not trying to be evidence-based, being evidence-based, and sort of moving the field that way. Yeah.
Fantastic. And you're working with GSK, they selected?
Yeah, we just signed an enterprise deal with GSK for 4 years, I think. So yeah, so and it's those partners that we're going to be working closely with to get at the bottom of these things that we talked about today. Yeah.
So there'll be a lot more data coming in on decentralized.
Yes, that's the goal. Data, we should be data-driven and evidence-based.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you to everyone at Trial Site News for joining in. Hope you stick around and subscribe, and see you next time.